Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Aragan. This day, May 6th, 1957, the Pulitzer Prize for Biography is awarded to a little-known author, someone who would really go on to fade into literary obscurity, a man by the name of John F. Kennedy. Oh, wait, no, I'm being told I'm reading here that Kennedy actually went on to do some other stuff in his life. But interestingly enough, this is the moment when Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts, he wins a Pulitzer Prize for his book, Profiles in Courage, and it does earn him a fair amount of national recognition, which, as we will discuss, was kind of part of the goal. And he would, of course, continue to build that reputation and become President Kennedy 3.5 or so years later. It is also maybe not a surprise that history has reevaluated this book, Profiles in Courage, in very interesting ways in the years since. So here to discuss Kennedy's Pulitzer are, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And this may be a Pulitzer twofer. We might touch on another very interesting Pulitzer story later, but let's talk about Profiles in Courage first. Niki, the book is a collection of profiles of what Kennedy has deemed courageous acts. What else do we need to know about the basics? And then we'll get into some of the stuff surrounding it.
So Kennedy kind of had courage as his brand when he came on the national stage. He had fought in World War II. He had been part of this moment where the ship that he was on had been blown up and he survived at sea. And so you would imagine a book called Profiles of Courage would be like detailing courageous acts by soldiers and by, all kinds of different people in U.S. history. But actually, it's Profiles in Courage of U.S. senators, of which Kennedy was one, as you mentioned. And it's 8 essays on 8 senators who he thought showed some sort of courage in standing up to public opinion and standing up to their own parties and standing up to the people that they represented. And that's kind of his definition of courage in this book, is to go against the tide.
Yeah, and we don't have to talk about all 8 of them, but, as you were looking at the collection, just what is your sense of how it was cobbled together, what the choices were in deciding what these profiles were going to be, Kellie?
Oh, man. So I say that because, I think if this book were to be published today, it would be quickly canceled. I mean, there's so much about the selection process that, one, sort of feels a little arbitrary, but 2, also feels like these people who he is attributing to having courage or bravery about the decisions they're making are making decisions that are almost always harmful to people, particularly African Americans, enslaved people, marginalized people. So when I look at, his choice of, say, Sam Houston for speaking out against the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, or for Edmund Ross, who voted to acquit Andrew Johnson's impeachment trial, I'm just like, ugh. Like, there's so much about this that made me question who I understood Kennedy to be in terms of this great liberal progressive president. And you read this book and it just sort of flies in the face of all of the things that I think we are taught about him and the things that he valued.
He writes an essay about Lucius Lamar, who eulogized Charles Sumner on the Senate floor during Reconstruction. 3 of Kennedy's 8 Senate heroes were slaveholders, which has certainly been something that we can look back on now differently than maybe was looked at the time. There's a number of moments in here where he kind of lauds people for quote unquote preserving the Union while ignoring maybe some of the other elements that went into that moment and why the Union was falling apart. There was also some real strategic stuff going on here. His choices are bipartisan, very regionally diverse. There's some Republicans, some Democrats. There are, of course, no women and no people of color, I don't think.
Well, in part because you're talking about the Senate, and so he has relatively few options there. But he is writing a campaign book, and I think it's really important to think of Profiles in Courage in that way, right? He wants to give a nod to all of his different constituencies, although interestingly, he's going to be running for president for a party that is split between white Southern segregationists and Black people, and he is really working those white segregationists in here. One person that we haven't mentioned yet is Daniel Webster, who he lauds for speaking in favor of the Compromise of 1850. And that's, we're going to continue to extend slavery. We're going to extend the Fugitive Slave Act. Like there are bad things in the Compromise of 1850. And he's really working that side of his party.
In describing Webster, he says, quote, "The preservation of the Union was far dearer to his heart than his opposition to slavery." So it's not like he's ignoring the slavery question. He's actually making some choices and some judgment calls about the kind of what counts as courage.
Yeah. I mean, the same thing could be said about Lincoln in his first, inaugural address. He also proposes to preserve the fugitive slave law in an attempt to keep the South within the Union. But I mean, also in a perfect world, he could have looked at Hiram Revels, Blanche K. Bruce, Black senators from Mississippi during Reconstruction. There's no doubt in my mind that it was courageous being a Black senator from Mississippi during the Reconstruction era. But, of course, I don't think that would have ever been considered. But again, these are the things that, from a 2021 perspective, none of this feels very good.
But to that point, it is long ago, but not that long ago, 1957. And so I'm curious, what is the story of America that Kennedy is tapping into here? And was there another story of America that he could have tapped into? Or is he really just reflecting the story that America was continuing to tell itself in that moment?
Well, look, he is speaking into a moment in the Cold War world where bipartisanship and compromise are kind of the watchwords of what it means to be a statesman politician. That's what he's tapping into. And he's also tapping into this, elite in which he lives. I mean, yes, there was a very different picture of the United States in the mid-1950s. This is the period of the Montgomery bus boycott. This is a period in which there's all sorts of activism and fervent in the United States that is not based on compromise, but that is not the world into which Kennedy is speaking. It's not the world in which he lives.
But it's also not the audience that he's targeting as well. I mean, I think that's really important. Who's going to read this book? Who's going to pick it up and sort of internalize its ideas and all of that are not necessarily marginalized people, women, Black people. He's not expecting them to read this book at all. So in that sense, it makes sense.
Yeah. And who are the voters who are going to elect him to, be president, if he has that in mind, or, who are the sort of party elites who are going to raise his profile. I think that's certainly the audience here. It kind of reminds me a little bit of almost I for some reason thought about the Ken Burns Civil War doc a fair amount here. As even in just the year since that's come out, we've started to think more deeply about how problematic a lot of that was, particularly the sort of elevation of Nathan Bedford Forrest as this great hero. But these profiles sort of buy into a lost cause narrative, buy into this idea of the Civil War as something that was brother against brother, as opposed to something that was about the enslavement of Black people.
Yeah. And that's, I think Ken Burns and I think of Shelby Foote and how he tells these wonderful romanticized stories. And you're like, wait a minute, this is problematic. But there's so much, I think, even in the 1950s, there's still so much nostalgia about this particular moment in the 19th century. There's still, Gone with the Wind is still one of the most popular films of all time in this moment. So when we think about like how people are reminiscing or choosing what to reminisce about and who they think are made tough decisions, I think a lot of that goes into support this ideology about like, lost causes and so forth.
Well, and that's such a good reminder that so much of the mythology around the Civil War and the lost cause mythology was actually written in the 20th century, right? In sort of the middle of the 20th century. It's not like it was written and then has been slowly eroded over time.
And I would say this is like peak because in the 60s and the 70s, historians start to do a much better job of revisiting a lot of this history and where you get revisionist history or changes in perspective in terms of like actually having Black people have agency within the story or speak within the stories that they're telling. But we're still sort of at the height of this, I think, in this moment where you don't have anyone who's doing that kind of work.
Yeah, and it would have been the cutting edge history in the very period that Kennedy is going through grade school and high school and college. Yeah. That really is when that lost cause history is coming to the fore.
I just had this vision of what if Kennedy had written like a people's history of the United States and just, I'm like, just drop that. I don't think he would have won the Pulitzer, and I don't know if he would have become president.
Not sure he would have won the presidency either.
No, they probably would have labeled him a communist.
Which they did anyway, right? There's a lesson in there. So it's interesting. We've been talking about the controversy as in the last 10 or 15 years as history is revisited. There was a controversy when this came out as well that was not related to these questions, but it was related more to authorship, right? And I mean, it appears that Kennedy did not necessarily write this book. How do you process this?
He had a lot of help, of help. That's a nice way to put it.
I would almost say he oversaw the writing of this book more so than he wrote this book. Look, I mean, Ted Sorensen was... That's right. I'm sure he was involved in brainstorming sessions, and we have letters that he wrote to Ted Sorensen, who was one of his speechwriters, who was actually the person who did all of the heavy lifting here. It's not that unusual in a lot of ways. I mean, Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, which was not only a national bestseller like Kennedy's book was, but was a defining book, right, that sort of put him on the national stage and said what his philosophies were. He didn't write a word of that book. It was written by his speechwriter, Brent Bozell. And so it's not that unusual, but it is something that the Kennedy family worked very hard to keep as quiet as possible.
Yeah. And I think certainly the winning the Pulitzer probably like just puts a target on your back when you're thinking about authorship. And we should have said, that winning the Pulitzer was also like very strategic part of this as well. The Kennedys, no surprise, had a sort of family connection to someone who was on the Pulitzer committee who advised them on when to put it out. It sort of feels like the Oscars race, like they had this whole team
it does.
positioning it and then lobbying behind the scenes to get this award. And then, of course, very quickly, I think the next year, there's accusations that he didn't write this or that it was ghostwritten. It's not until the 2000s that Kennedy's speechwriter Ted Sorensen sort of like basically explains what happened. And I do think the ghostwriting is a spectrum. I think is an important thing to point out. And I do think Kennedy, like, from what we know and what seems to be true now that we know, he did like write a lot of the first and last chapters and sort of set the direction of the book. And he was like pretty closely involved and giving notes and overseeing. It's almost like, and maybe I have a soft spot for this just because a lot of the work I do is like this, but he's like an executive producer of the book, right? He's like a showrunner of the book, which I think there's artistry in that, and I think there's value in that.
I think there's always I mean, ghostwriters have always been around. Speechwriters certainly have always been around. We are well aware that most elected officials are not writing their speeches, and that's acceptable. Even when it comes to like certain books, we know that like, okay, there are editors, there's a team of people curating this project. But I think it's twofold. I think it's the fact that he won the Pulitzer Prize, and I also think it's the fact that, people wanted to believe that this was all him, and right. I think it plays into the myth that we have of Kennedy as being this great leader, this brilliant mind, this, sort of larger than life person. And if he didn't write it, or if he, just sort of spearheaded it, then maybe he's not as great as we think he is. Ted Sorensen, who helped significantly with the book, was well aware that, the idea that this was completely ghostwritten or not written by Kennedy could ruin his political career. So he swore an affidavit, basically swearing that he was only there to assist in the assembly and preparation of the research of the book. But also, once the book is out there, Sorensen gets about $100,000 after the Pulitzer Prize is awarded. So, it's questionable. Is this royalties? Is this thanks so much for your help? Is this hush money? But, but I think that this took place is something that is, I don't know, something to think about.
Yeah. And Sorensen remains sort of in the Kennedy circles, and it is not until Sorensen's book many, many years later that we kind of get the final details of how this all went down. No surprise, and certainly this had been the case before, but I think this in the modern era, no surprise, set the standard for the fact that politicians who wanted to burnish their brand would write a book. And this happens all the time now. But Nixon basically saw what Kennedy did with Profile in Courage and took notes. And he is quoted as saying, there's something about being an author which really builds the reputation of a political figure. And in 1962, he wrote his book, Six Crises, which is his response to Profiles in Courage. Not to get too far into the political book industrial complex, but Niki, what is your sense of whether that actually is still a thing out there, or is it all now you need a podcast?
Well, in my own self-interest, I'm going to say that all presidential candidates need a podcast now. It does seem to be the direction they're moving. But it does matter. Barack Obama, right, makes a name for himself with both Dreams of My Father and Audacity of Hope. And those are two books that he actually wrote. There is the kind of political campaign book, for want of a better phrase. It's almost always ghostwritten. It's terribly, terribly bland. And that's one of the reasons something like Dreams from My Father stood out so much, because it was so open and so authentic about things that you would normally think of as presidential hopeful killers, right? About drug use and about his struggles, and very open and personal about things like race. And it ended up being something that really burnished his reputation, and it introduced him to people in a way that they found very appealing. So there's space there, but most of these books are destined for the remainder bin.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I love Dreams from My Father, but then you go forward and you read Audacity of Hope and you're like,
more of a campaign book, yeah.
This is totally a campaign book. And I mean, every cycle you see a new book that comes out that, was meant to sort of give you a bigger picture of who this person is. But they almost often reveal very little, very, very little. It's the same sort of my father worked hard, my mother worked hard, I did this. It's okay, we know that.
Yeah. Although it is this interesting, I agree, they are almost always very bland. But they also do provide this weird fodder for 5-10 years later. Some enterprising journalist will go back and actually read the book, which I am convinced no one actually does at the time. And they'll find these weird passages and be like, oh man, Rick Santorum's book was telling us who he was all along, or and certainly I don't know who's out there reading Andrew Cuomo's book, but that one
not very many people. Only about 48,000 bought it.
Yeah, there you go. So how do you know that number right off the top of your head?
Because it was such a remarkably small number.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a good little journalistic trick is to actually go and read those books, because you never know. So as we start to wrap up, I did say that this was going to be a little bit of a Pulitzer twofer, because obviously we hook this to a date, and this is around the time when the Pulitzers come out. So there was one other interesting Pulitzer moment that caught our eye, which was in 1926, Sinclair Lewis declined the Pulitzer. He was awarded the Pulitzer for his novel Arrowsmith, which is spelled Arrowsmith, and he turned it down. So Niki, very quickly, we just think this is an interesting tidbit. Why is Sinclair Lewis turning down the Pulitzer?
So he turns it down because the description of who the prize is awarded to mentions things like who best reflects the moral standards of his time. It just has this language of, this is a book that is good for society as opposed to this is a good book. And Sinclair Lewis was like, this is only going to encourage people to write bad books. That's not the standard I want my book to be measured by. And so he writes kind of an open letter where he says thanks, but no thanks.
It's interesting. It sounds very noble and in line with Sinclair Lewis. If you read accounts of this and you keep reading, there's always that one little caveat where it's like, oh, and there's also a chance that he was a little salty about not having won it a couple years before for his previous book. And so he just wanted to send an FU to the Pulitzer Committee. It's always a mix of those. But it is interesting to see him turn it down.
I feel like we need to do a whole episode on like the Pulitzers and the history of like the Pulitzer Prize, because there's so much controversy and drama when it comes to awards.
Exactly, yeah. And this book, Aerosmith, is actually, maybe we should do a proper episode on it, because Aerosmith is a really fascinating book just in and of itself, not just because Sinclair Lewis turned it down, but it's a book about basically someone who is starting a medical career and the choices they have to make between going out into the field and helping people or doing research. And from what I gather, sort of in the medical community, it's a real touchstone book because it really does describe kind of a lot of the things that doctors have to go through. But then, no surprise, like any previous work regarding medicine read in the year 2020 or 2021, it is also about vaccination hesitancy. And obviously this was written a little bit in the wake of the 1918 flu. Mm-hmm. So it is one of these very interesting books to go back and reread. Is it where the band Aerosmith got their name, Niki? I feel like
I'm just going to assume that they were backstage reading Sinclair Lewis.
Wait, you didn't actually do this. I did this research. I looked this up. I thought you had too. So, sort of is the answer. One of the guys in Aerosmith, I don't like Aerosmith, I don't know their names, but one of the guys in Aerosmith basically came up with the name, spelled it Aero Smith, and it was just a word that he liked. He was sort of obsessed with airplanes or something. When he brought it to the rest of the band, who they had all been friends in high school, he was like, I have a name for our band, it's Aerosmith. And all of them were like, wait a minute, that Sinclair Lewis book that they made us read in 9th grade? Like, why are we going to name our band at that? And he's like, no. It's about this other thing. So there is sort of a connection there.
I'm impressed. Yeah. He fell out of the canon before I got to high school. So yeah. I'm very impressed with their literacy.
All right, let's leave it there. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia from